Hey, I'm Warren Sprouse. This is the Bible Forum. It's September 11th, 2016. We're looking at life through a biblical lens. Where were you when the trade towers came down? Used to be everybody remembered where they were when they heard of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Later on, it was VE Day, and then the day a man walked on the moon. Now it's 9/11, but not everybody remembers. Those who were too young, those who just don't care. And then there are the many who do care, do remember, but refuse to believe the official story, or simply reject the idea that something like this happened out of hand. We call them conspiracy theories. We call them alternate realities. Or maybe it's just a simple refusal to blame anyone but the 9 participants, as though they were operating on their own and without regard to any ideology, any training, support they might have had. It kind of keeps us from feeling anything but fear. And that's the way free societies work. You're free to believe whatever you want. But the truth? Those buildings came down. But they came down in round 2. If you were around, you know that. This was the second attack on the trade centers, those twin towers, not the first. And it was the second attack by the same outfit, by the same people. And it wasn't just some malcontents. It was a disciplined, structured, highly orchestrated and financed attack by a Muslim group. What did we learn from that? I will suggest to you later that we learned nothing. We'll also talk about Christianity in the 20th century. I got an article this week about a pastor, a 67-year-old retired pastor, who was in a wheelchair and in a nursing home. He was in the habit of discussing theology, apparently, with an 80-year-old man by the name of Alan, and the residents and others there said that the discussions would almost always be heated disagreements about the Bible. The day came, not that long ago, when the 67-year-old retired pastor in the wheelchair shot and killed Alan, shooting him twice in the head, immediately after they'd had a disagreement about the Bible. Those there said it was very surprising. I'll bet it was. The man was a pastor. They didn't understand this. Some said they couldn't believe that this was going on. The man in the wheelchair fled the murder scene, but he was arrested 3 blocks away. He was charged with first-degree murder. Have you ever been in a heated discussion about the Word of God that caused you to get out your gun and go kill somebody? Now I'm going to upset you when I say this, but it's not something Christians do. I can say that because in Philippians 2:13 it says that a Christian is a person who has God living within them. It is the God which is in you, both to will and to do His good will, the things that honor and glorify Him. This kind of thing doesn't occur to Christians. Maybe the first year or two they were saved, they're still working through some of the issues, but 67-year-old pastor, it's an amazing thing. I also read a statistic this week. In his latest book, The War on Guns, subtitled Arming Yourself Against Gun Control Lies. John R. Lott Jr. points to statistics to show that from 1950 to 2010, not one mass public shooting took place in an area where citizens could arm themselves in self-defense. Not one. The entire period, 1950 to 2016. If my math is right, that's over 60 years. In all of that time, just over 1% of mass public shootings occurred in these places. This means that the gun-free zones, the gun-restricted zones, are targets of choice. And the gun control movement wants the world to believe that gun-free zones don't endanger innocents. So we ought to have more than that. If we had a gun-free zone, people wouldn't get killed because nobody would be having a gun. But this study exposes the fallacy to that argument, presenting reality. Attackers are not just uninterested parties who choose their targets by chance. Not one mass public shooting has occurred where a citizen was allowed to carry a gun. I saw a list just last week of convicted killers who admitted deliberately avoiding places where someone may have a gun. We all remember the Colorado movie theater shooter. Remember, he had the red hair. He deliberately did not choose the other theater in town, he said, because there you were allowed to carry a gun. He couldn't be sure. And don't forget Charleston. The Charleston shooter, Mother Emanuel, AME Church, he said he was planning to attack the Citadel. That's a college here in town. Until he realized that the Citadel had armed security. Gives a person pause, doesn't it? J.P. Morgan is restricting ATM cash withdrawals. Students of biblical eschatology know that God has predicted that no one is going to be permitted to buy and sell during the Great Tribulation without first surrendering to the worship of Satan. Bible students and critics have scoffed at such a global feat. Can't imagine that anything like this would be a possibility. That is, until the last 20 years. Until the introduction of these machines whereby we get our cash. Until we entered into the digital age. Until online banking and banking by phone became a reality. The spokesperson for J.P. Morgan says the bank has seen high dollar withdrawals at both new and old ATMs. This change that occurred in just the last month affects roughly 18,000 automated teller machines nationwide and does follow, I got to word it right, the interim step that they made earlier this year, which we talked about, that limited non-customer cash removals to $1,000 per transaction. The earlier move was made as a temporary fix while the bank could make software changes, which they now have rolled out and are certainly more stringent, controlling the daily limits. The spokesperson added that the bank, quote, felt it was prudent to set withdrawal limits on all our ATMs after identifying some large cash withdrawals by non-customers. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Why did a Christian pastor give Donald Trump a prayer shawl to wear during a religious service? It's not something you see in every church you go to. Or is it? Some Jewish observers are troubled. Some are upset. They're angered by the whole thing. Many Christian leaders are scratching their head. This prayer shawl, this talit, or talit, is a ritual garment meant to be worn only by Jews. A conservative rabbi by the name of Danya Runtenberg tweeted, quote, "This is the worst kind of appropriation." The Guardian's Ben Jacob asks, quote, "Wait, did Donald Trump get bar mitzvahed?" But Bishop Wayne Jackson of Great Faith Ministries International, the man who leads the church and invited the Donald to come, told the Times of Israel, quote, "This was not anything that is unusual for us. You go to my church, you'll see a lot of people with them on. I have several of them myself. I have a Jewish lawyer who gave me his personal talit. I have about 5 or 10 of them for myself." What's going on? Well, on the surface, in the simplest possible way, this is called the dumbing down of the church. The contemporary church borrowing from the culture whatever works. If people want jump, jive, and sensual music, give it to them. The goal is to get them to come to church. If people want enthusiastic, entertaining, emotional pep rallies, give it to them. The goal is to get them to church. If people want to feel they are somehow embracing divine ceremonialism, give it to them. Give them whatever they want, just don't give them Bible. They can't handle that. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. Did you hear Glenn Beck's interview with Roy Williams? You don't know who Roy Williams is any more than I do. Roy Williams has spent his life looking at what makes people do what they do. He's built a large and successful business on this particular premise, helping small business clients for more than 25 years. He's written several self-help type books for this particular segment of society, and according to observers, he's been able to stimulate a miraculous growth in businesses all over the world. His most recent book, Pendulum: How Past Generations Shape Our Present and Our Future, was the reason for this Beck interview. The interview started with Beck's having read the book, and the author began by explaining how the Bible reveals, or at least implies, that there are 40-year cycles through which humanity revolves. He made that statement in passing and then launched into his own description of the book. He outlined the 20 and 40-year cycles in American history, going back to Lincoln. Now, I grew up with people talking about 20-year war cycles. I also heard about 40-year economic cycles. I never heard they were biblical. Biblical meaning God has woven them into our system, into our lives for a purpose. I always heard them in terms of a backward observation. Looking back, you can see this. This man was talking about projecting forward based on what appeared to be unalterable laws or principles that were first propounded in the scriptures. I was driving in the car. I listened long enough to get the title of the book. The same week I heard Rush Limbaugh talking about cycles, only he was talking about liberal versus conservative cycles. He revealed that conservative thinkers, academics, and others never think in terms of conservative values becoming dominant in the society. That is not the reason they work to bring this in. Rather, simply to keep the liberal values at bay. And the idea is that humanity always gravitates toward the liberal side, and that conservatives work to keep them from going too far. I thought both of those discussions were fascinating. And while neither man worked to bring them together, I thought somebody needed to do that. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. We're celebrating 9/11, the Trade Center battles. Where were you when the trade towers came down? Used to be everybody remembered where they were when they heard of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Everybody then knew where they were on VE Day. or when a man walked on the moon. Now it's 9/11. But I want to suggest to you that not everyone remembers. There's a significant percentage of society who were too young. There's also a significant segment that just doesn't care. They don't even know who the vice president is, and it's not important. But there are many people who do care, and yet either refuse to believe the official story or simply reject the idea out of hand. They have what they call conspiracy theories, alternate realities, or simply they're just refusing to blame anyone but the 9 participants, as though they were operating on their own without regard to any ideology, any training, any support. I guess it keeps some people from feeling fear. But this is how free societies work. And the truth is that these towers came down in round 2. And they didn't come down on their own. These buildings were targeted by Osama bin Laden in 1993. And men drove trucks under, in the parking area, under the World Trade Center with bombs. The trucks themselves were the bombs. And they blew them up. But it didn't work. It did damage. It rattled the buildings, but they stood strong and were repaired. When the airplanes hit, it was round 2. And these men who flew those planes, hijacked those planes, were being paid by somebody. When those things came down, there was rejoicing in that cave over in the Middle East. These men were being motivated to die for a religious belief. And close to 3,000 human beings perished on that day, many of them, most of them Americans. Hundreds more over the next 10 years due to the hazardous material they breathed or the injuries they suffered. Why? So an Islamic group could have the privilege of making a point. Killing innocent people, killing unsuspecting people, killing non-combatants. In the Orthodox Muslim mind, there are no innocent people. There are only Orthodox Muslims and infidels. Infidels can only be converted or killed. That's their faith? No, that's their law. Islam is not a religious faith. It is a religious law. Violate that law as a Muslim or a non-Muslim, and you will die. Christians and those influenced by biblical Christianity don't think this way. For us, religion is a faith. It's not something we have to do. Rather, it's something we believe. And because we believe it, we do. We do as we are motivated internally by the power of the Spirit of God to do. These are radically different religious systems. You're probably not paying a whole lot of attention to it, but the Hajj began this week. Last year, 2,300 people perished at the Hajj when people began to stampede. We're talking Mecca, Saudi Arabia. People coming from Asia, Africa, and every point in between. Nearly 1.5 million Muslims beginning the annual Hajj in western Saudi Arabia just this past Saturday. Tens of thousands of Iranians are absent because of long-running tensions between the Shiite and Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia. That friction that was exaggerated by the stampede. These Muslims are following in the footsteps of their prophet Muhammad, who performed the same rituals about 1,400 years ago. A ritual that is designed to promote the bonds of Islamic brotherhood and sisterhood by showing that everyone is equal in the eyes of Allah. The Hajj makes Muslims feel real importance of life here on earth and the afterlife. by stripping away all markers of social status, wealth, and pride. They kept to wear the same garments. In the Hajj, they are all truly equal. They wear simple white clothes called ihram. During the Hajj, the pilgrims perform acts of worship. They renew their sense of purpose in the world. Mecca is that place that is holy to all Muslims. It is so holy that no Muslim is allowed to enter. For Muslims, the Hajj is the fifth and final pillar of Islam. Islam, a faith system? No. There are 5 pillars to Islam. One is faith. You must believe certain things. The other is prayer. You must pray 5 times a day, facing east. There is charity. You must give alms. There is fasting. You must not eat during these particular times. And there is this pilgrimage to Mecca. That is not a recipe for a faith. That is a recipe for a religion. They serve Allah, the moon god. They have no idea what he wants. They only know what he has told them to do. They are fond of simply answering a question with inshallah. Whatever will be, will be. They submit, which is what Islam means. He is their master. They are the servant. And they just surrender to his will. And if they stumble and fall into a vat of chocolate, that's God's will. If they rise to the pinnacle of success and are decked in gold everything, that's the will of Allah. And everything in between. That is not a faith system. These people are making this trip to Mecca because they have to. Every Muslim who is able to walk is required to come. Ideally once a year, but at least once in your lifetime. During this Hajj, the pilgrims will perform acts of worship. They'll renew their sense of purpose in the world. That purpose? To serve Allah, who never tells them what he wants. To kill all who refuse to submit. That is the purpose of Islam on the planet. Here in America, we have an open society. Enter America's first Muslim federal judge. Well, not yet. But our president has nominated the first Muslim federal judge to the U.S. Circuit Court of District of Columbia. The Council on American Islamic Relations, Islamic Society of North Carolina, is praising him. This is a marvelous thing in their sight. The nominee is a U.S. trained lawyer who has practiced law in the United States for 10 years and has no judicial experience. He does have ties to Islamists, including those in Saudi Arabian government. He also has been hailed by the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Islamic Society of North America. These two organizations are offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have links to the Hamas terrorist organization as documented by the FBI during the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2007. The argument? Well, he's not particularly religious. He's a nominal Muslim. But he has no experience as a judge, let alone a federal judge. He has no record the Senate can investigate. He does have ties to extremist groups, and we're expected to believe that everything's going to be okay, or we're just being bigots. Well, this particular judge has defended two Muslim filmmakers in their quest to get pro-Islamic, anti-Islamophobia advertisements placed in the New York subway system. He has also represented the Saudi Arabian government in a dispute involving the Sharia-compliant Islamic school in the U.S. In addition, there's the opinion of Daniel Akbari, a certified Sharia lawyer and Islamic expert. Akbari defected to the U.S. and now lives in Texas, and he says that Muslims come in several forms, including cultural Muslims, who are basically atheist or agnostic and do not practice their faith. Did I tell you Islam is not a faith? Anyway, Akbari makes a distinction between a Muslim and an Islamist. One is either born into Islam or simply lives in an Islamic state. The other is radicalized. The Islamic goes to the mosque every Friday to pray and practices the tenets of Islam. Akbari says one who does this is radicalized. It happens there at the mosque. If they are practicing Muslim and not just a cultural Muslim, he is not just your harmless neighbor. And while all Islamists are not terrorists, they all believe in Sharia as being superior to any Western form of law. An Islamist is one who has an orthodox understanding of Islam. Organizations like CARE and ISNA all have orthodox understanding of the authoritative Islamic sources. If you have that, then you believe orthodox rules must rule a person's life, Akbari said. If you are a pro even one law of Sharia, you're an Islamist. He says, we don't know if Mr. Qureshi is an Islamist or a Muslim. But since he was seeing on Twitter that CARE and ISNA and all those activists for Sharia are supporting him, he's suspicious. He thinks the guy's an Islamist. What do you think's going to happen? Will he get approved? Kind of depends on who gets elected president, doesn't it? And what kind of a Congress we have. These are very strange times in America.